Some women are wives, and some are just placeholders, Vanessa said, her voice smooth as champagne, cutting clean through the soft hum of the ballroom as crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over silk gowns and tailored suits. And Claire Whitmore stood there with a glass in her hand that suddenly felt heavier than it should, her fingers tightening just slightly, just enough for the stem to tremble before she steadied it again. Because she had learned long ago that breaking in public was a luxury she could never afford. Across the room, Ethan Cole laughed, that same effortless, confident laugh that used to belong to her. Now draped over Vanessa Blake's shoulder like a trophy, he couldn't wait to show off, and the crowd leaned in, drawn to the spectacle, drawn to the upgrade, because that's what they were all thinking even if no one said it out loud, that the model was brighter, newer, more fitting for the man Ethan believed he had become. Claire could feel the shift in the room, the subtle reordering of status, the way conversations curved away from her and toward him, like gravity had quietly changed direction, and for a moment, just a moment, the past flickered beneath her skin, late nights waiting alone in a penthouse that never felt like home, the quiet negotiations of her own worth, the way Ethan had slowly, carefully rewritten her into something smaller, something easier to outgrow. Claire. Ethan's voice finally reached her, and when she turned, his smile was polite, distant, the kind reserved for acquaintances, not for the woman who had once built his world from the ground up. "You look, well," he said, the pause doing more damage than any insult could, and Vanessa's lips curved just slightly, a smile that didn't need volume to be heard. Claire met his eyes, steady now, her breath even, the noise of the room fading into something distant and irrelevant, because she understood something in that exact second that no one else in that ballroom could see. Not Ethan, not Vanessa, not the people orbiting his success. She understood that this moment, this humiliation wrapped in silk and smiles, was not the end of her story but the last time she would ever stand in a room where she did not control the outcome. She set her glass down with a quiet click against the marble table, the sound small but precise, like a decision being made. And for the briefest second, Ethan's eyes flickered, as if something about her calm unsettled him, as if some instinct warned him that he had misread the situation entirely. "Take care, Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying no anger, no pleading, only a calm that didn't belong to the woman he thought he had replaced. And then she turned, walking through the crowd that parted just enough to let her pass, her heels echoing against polished floors, each step lighter than the last, as if she were shedding something invisible with every inch of distance. No one stopped her, no one called her back, and behind her, the laughter resumed, louder this time, brighter, as if the room itself was eager to erase her presence completely. But Claire didn't look back, not once, because somewhere beneath the quiet rhythm of her steps, beneath the steady rise and fall of her breath, something had already begun to shift, something unseen, something patient, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And as the night swallowed her whole, the only truth that lingered, silent and absolute, was this. He believed he had replaced her, but he had no idea what he had just set in motion. The silence after she left did not follow her. It stayed behind, clinging to the edges of that ballroom. But Claire carried something else with her into the night air, something colder, sharper, something that did not need witnesses to exist. And by the time the city lights reflected across the glass of her cab window, she was no longer replaying Vanessa's words or Ethan's expression. She was remembering numbers, contracts, conversations whispered months before that night ever happened, because the truth was, she had not walked into that ballroom unprepared. She had walked in to confirm something. The next morning, the world did exactly what it always did. It moved on without her. Headlines about Ethan Cole's expansion deal circulated through business feeds, his name tied to phrases like aggressive growth and strategic dominance. And Vanessa appeared beside him in carefully curated photos, all sharp angles and perfect lighting, the kind of image that told a story people wanted to believe. But Claire did not read the articles for admiration. She read them for patterns, for timing, for the gaps between what was said and what was quietly omitted. Her apartment was small compared to the life she used to live, but it was deliberate, every inch of it, a place that belonged only to her. And the morning, Light fell across a stack of documents spread neatly across her table. Acquisition trails, shell corporations, investment flows that looped and folded back into themselves like a maze designed to confuse anyone who looked too quickly. But Claire did not look quickly. She traced each line with patience, her pen tapping once against the paper, as if keeping time with something only she could hear. Months ago, when the divorce settlement had stripped her down to what Ethan believed was nothing, he had overlooked the one thing he never valued, her ability to see beyond the surface, to understand not just what something was worth, but who controlled it and why. And that oversight had been the first mistake he never realized he made. She remembered the first meeting, not in a grand office, not under chandeliers, but in a quiet conference room 12 floors above a street no one important bothered to notice, where Jonathan Reed had studied her without interruption, his expression unreadable, as she laid out a structure that did not rely on his power, but aligned with it. And when she finished, the silence had stretched just long enough to test her resolve before he leaned back slightly and said, "You are not asking for help." And Claire had met his gaze without hesitation. "No, I am offering an opportunity." And that was the moment everything shifted, not because he saved her, but because he recognized she did not need saving. Now, as she stood by her window watching the city wake, beneath a pale gray sky, her phone buzzed once on the table, a message from a number she did not have saved but already knew, a confirmation, brief and precise, the final piece of a structure that had been quietly building while Ethan celebrated his victories. And for the first time since that night, Claire allowed herself a small breath, not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because nothing had been taken yet, nothing had been revealed, and the most powerful moves were never the loud ones. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was preparing for the deal that would define his future, confident, untouchable, unaware that every step forward had already been mapped, every advantage accounted for. And as Claire picked up her coat, her reflection in the glass no longer resembled the woman who had stood beneath those chandeliers, because that woman had been seen, judged, dismissed. But this one, this version of her, existed in the space no one thought to look, and that was exactly where control began. By the time Ethan Cole stepped into the glass tower that morning, the city already felt like it belonged to him, the skyline stretching wide beneath a crisp blue sky. Every reflection in those mirrored buildings echoing the version of himself he had worked so carefully to construct, controlled, respected, untouchable. And inside the boardroom on the 42nd floor, everything was exactly as it should be: polished wood, filtered sunlight, men in tailored suits exchanging quiet confidence over numbers that carried more weight than most people would ever understand. The deal was hours away from closing, the kind of acquisition that would not just expand his company, but redefine his position in the market. And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting against the table, listening as legal teams finalized language that sounded like victory, because in his mind, this was the moment everything he had built was about to solidify into something permanent. Across the table, representatives from the investment group remained composed, their expressions neutral, their words precise. And Ethan barely noticed the subtle shift in tone, the careful phrasing that placed control not in his hands, but somewhere just out of view, because he had already decided how this story would end. The screen at the far end of the room lit up with the final ownership structure. Layers of entities arranged in a clean, logical chain, and for a brief moment, everything made sense, until it did not, until one name appeared at the top, not a corporation, not a fund, but a person. And the room fell into a silence that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze narrowing just slightly, the confidence in his posture holding, but something beneath it shifting, something he could not yet name. And then the door opened. The sound was soft, almost insignificant, but it carried through the room with a precision that turned every head at once, and the rhythm of heels against the polished floor followed, steady, unhurried, familiar in a way that did not belong in that space, not according to the version of reality Ethan had been living in. Claire Whitmore stepped inside, as if she had always belonged there, her presence quiet but undeniable, her expression composed, untouched by the tension that had begun to gather in the air. And for the first time since she walked out of that ballroom months ago, Ethan looked at her without an audience shaping the moment, without noise to soften the truth of what he was seeing. She did not look different in a way that could be measured, not wealth, not style, not status, but something else entirely, something rooted deeper than appearance, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. One of the men at the table stood, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement, and the introduction was simple, almost understated. Ms. Whitmore is the majority stakeholder, and the words landed with a weight that did not need emphasis. Ethan's mind moved quickly, faster than the silence allowed, tracing back through every agreement, every signature, every assumption he had made. And for the first time, the structure he believed he controlled revealed itself for what it was, something built around him, not by him. Claire took a seat at the head of the table, not as a gesture, not as a statement, but as a fact that required no explanation, her hands resting lightly against the surface as she glanced down at the documents before her, then back up, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, without anger, without anything that could be mistaken for the woman he once thought he understood. "Shall we proceed?" she said calmly, her voice steady. And in that moment, everything Ethan had believed about control, about replacement, about power, shifted into something far less certain, because the future he had been so sure of was no longer something he could reach. It was something he had already signed away, and she had been there, quietly, the entire time. The room did not move after she spoke, as if even time needed a moment to adjust to the new order of things, and Claire could feel it, the shift settling into the space like a quiet, irreversible truth, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Across from her, Ethan remained still, his fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table. The same hands that once signed documents with effortless certainty, now holding on to something that no longer belonged to him. And for the first time, she saw it clearly. Not the man who had dismissed her, not the version of him polished for rooms like this, but the pause beneath it all, the hesitation he could not disguise. The legal team resumed their voices, low and precise, language flowing again as if nothing had happened. But everything had, every clause now anchored to her authority, every approval resting quietly in her control, and Claire listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, because she did not need to assert anything. The structure itself spoke for her. Ethan's gaze flickered once more to the screen, to her name, then back to her, searching for something familiar, perhaps a trace of the woman he believed he had left behind. But there was nothing there for him to recognize. No resentment, no vindication, only a calm that came from understanding exactly where she stood. "This is a mistake," he said finally, his voice measured but tighter than before, and the words seemed less like a statement, and more like something he needed to believe. And Claire tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply acknowledging the space between what he thought was true and what actually was. "No," she replied softly, her tone even. "This is structure." And the distinction settled into the air with a clarity that left no room for argument. The man seated beside her slid a document forward, its pages crisp, its significance understated but final, and Claire glanced down briefly before placing her signature with a smooth, unhurried motion, the pen moving across the paper as if it had always been meant to. And in that single act, months of quiet strategy, unseen decisions, and patient restraint aligned into something tangible. Ethan watched, the realization unfolding not in a single moment, but in layers, each one peeling back the certainty he had built his confidence on. Because this was not a confrontation he could win, not a negotiation he could redirect. This was an outcome already decided long before he ever entered the room. Claire set the pen down gently, the sound barely audible, and when she looked up again, her gaze held his for just a second longer than necessary, not to challenge him, not to prove anything, but simply to acknowledge what now existed between them, a balance that had been restored without a single raised voice. Outside, the city continued as it always did, traffic moving in steady lines, sunlight reflecting off glass and steel, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place high above it. And Claire rose from her seat with the same composure she had carried into the room, smoothing the sleeve of her coat, as if concluding something routine. No one stopped her. No one questioned her, because there was nothing left to question, and as she walked toward the door, the soft echo of her steps marking the end of something that had once defined her. She did not look back, not because she needed to prove strength, but because there was nothing behind her that held any weight anymore. And for Ethan, left standing in a space that no longer answered to him, the realization settled slowly, undeniably, that the moment he thought he had replaced her had never been about her at all. It had been the beginning of losing everything he believed was his. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft, final chime, sealing the quiet victory inside the walls she had just left. And Claire stood alone as the numbers descended slowly, her reflection in the mirrored panel steady, composed, unchanged on the surface, yet entirely different beneath it. Because this was not the kind of triumph that demanded celebration. It was the kind that settled deep, quiet, irreversible. When the doors opened to the lobby, the world greeted her exactly as it always did, marble floors gleaming, muted conversations drifting through the air, the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne, lingering just enough to remind anyone who walked through that space what power was supposed to look like. But Claire moved through it without pause, without hesitation, because she no longer needed to belong to that version of power. She had already redefined it on her own terms. Outside, the city stretched wide beneath a pale afternoon sky, taxis gliding past, sunlight catching on glass towers that once felt distant and unattainable. And as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the rhythm of the city folded around her like it always had, indifferent, constant, real, and for the first time in years, she felt no need to measure herself against it. Her phone buzzed once in her hand, a message from Jonathan Reed, brief and precise as always. "It is done." And Claire allowed herself the smallest exhale, not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because nothing about this had been sudden, nothing about it accidental. Every step had been placed long before anyone realized there was a path at all. She began to walk, her heels striking the pavement in a steady cadence. And with each step, memories surfaced not as wounds but as markers. The nights she had doubted herself, the moments she had been told she was not enough, not ambitious enough, not sharp enough, not necessary. And now those words felt distant, hollow, like echoes from a place she no longer inhabited. Across the street, a large digital billboard flickered to life, an image of Ethan and Vanessa captured in perfect lighting, their smiles curated, their story still intact for the world that had not yet caught up to what had just shifted behind closed doors. And Claire glanced at it only briefly, her gaze calm, unbothered, because she understood something they did not. That image was already outdated, already disconnected from the reality unfolding beneath it. Somewhere above, in that glass tower, conversations were changing, decisions being reconsidered, power quietly rebalancing itself around a truth no one could ignore. And Ethan, for all his confidence, would have to sit with the understanding that nothing had been taken from him in a moment. It had been slipping away long before he ever noticed. Claire reached the corner and paused as the light changed, the crosswalk signal blinking softly. And for a second, the city held its breath with her, then moved again, and she stepped forward, not as the woman who had been replaced, not as the one who had returned, but as someone entirely beyond that story, someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. And as she disappeared into the flow of people, her presence blending seamlessly into the world she had quietly claimed, the only truth that remained, unspoken but undeniable, was this: she had never come back to be seen. She had come back to take control, and now that she had, there was nothing left behind worth looking at again. Upstairs, the silence did not last long. It never did in rooms built on power, because silence invites questions, and questions demand answers. And Ethan sat there as the conversations slowly reshaped themselves around a reality he had not prepared for. Voices lower now, more careful, as if speaking too loudly might confirm what none of them wanted to fully acknowledge yet. That control had shifted, not dramatically, not violently, but with a precision that left no room for reversal. He remained seated even after the others began to gather their documents, his eyes fixed on the signature that did not belong to him, the name that now defined the structure he once believed he commanded. And for the first time in years, the future he had planned felt uncertain, not because it was taken, but because it had never been entirely his to begin with. Outside the boardroom, Assistants moved quickly, phones pressed to ears, schedules adjusting in real time, and the ripple effect had already begun. Subtle but undeniable. Investors asking different questions, partners recalibrating expectations, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Vanessa stood near the glass wall of Ethan's office, her reflection sharp against the skyline, her posture perfect, but her expression no longer as effortless as it had been the night she spoke so confidently under those chandeliers. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice controlled. But there was a slight edge beneath it, something unfamiliar, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not understand the question, but because he was still piecing together the answer himself, and the silence between them stretched just long enough to expose something neither of them had ever needed to face before: uncertainty. He finally stood, adjusting his cufflinks with a movement that was more habit than intention, his reflection catching in the glass beside hers. Two figures that once symbolized assent, now standing still in a moment that did not belong to them anymore. "It is temporary," he said, the words steady but lacking the conviction they once carried so easily, and Vanessa turned slightly, studying him, as if trying to determine whether she still recognized the man she had aligned herself with. Across the city, Claire moved through her day without interruption, a quiet sequence of meetings, calls, confirmations, each one aligning with the structure she had already set in motion, and yet none of it required urgency, because the outcome was no longer dependent on effort. It was already secured. In a small conference room, sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting soft lines across the table as she reviewed a new set of proposals, her pen moving with the same calm precision as before, each decision deliberate, each choice measured, not to prove anything, not to win anything, but simply because this was now her position. A junior associate hesitated slightly before speaking, unsure whether to address her by name or title, and Claire looked up, offering a brief nod that settled the uncertainty without a word, because authority, she had learned, was not declared, it was recognized. Later, as the afternoon lights softened into evening, she paused by the window once more, the city stretching beneath her in quiet motion, and for a moment, she allowed herself to stand still, not reflecting on what had happened, but acknowledging what had changed, not in the world, but within herself, because the greatest shift had never been about Ethan, or Vanessa, or the rooms she had walked into and out of. It had been about the space she now occupied without question, without doubt, without the need to be seen in order to exist, and somewhere behind her, unnoticed and unspoken, the past finally lost its hold, not erased, not forgotten, but rendered irrelevant by the simple, undeniable truth that she had moved beyond it, completely, quietly, and permanently. The following week did not announce itself with headlines or dramatic shifts. It unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way real power always did, through small adjustments that only those paying attention could feel, and Claire noticed them all: the slight change in tone during meetings, the way executives paused a fraction longer before speaking, the subtle recalibration of respect that no one openly acknowledged but everyone instinctively followed. She sat at the long conference table, sunlight stretching across polished wood, listening as projections were presented, her gaze steady, her presence no longer questioned, because the structure now answered to her whether anyone chose to say it out loud or not. Across town, Ethan moved through a different kind of silence, one filled with calls that did not return as quickly, emails that carried a different weight, conversations that once flowed easily now edged with caution, and he found himself replaying moments he had dismissed before, searching for where control had slipped, for when certainty had turned into assumption. But every path led back to the same realization, that he had underestimated something he never thought to measure. Vanessa watched him from the edge of his office, her reflection merging with the skyline beyond the glass, her confidence no longer effortless but maintained, carefully, deliberately, and though she said little, her presence carried a quiet question neither of them could fully answer. What happens when the future you aligned yourself with begins to shift beneath your feet? "You should fix this," she said finally, her voice controlled, but the certainty it once held now thinner, and Ethan turned toward her, his expression composed. But there was something behind it now, something that did not belong to the man she had chosen. "It is already done," he replied. And for the first time, the words sounded less like authority and more like recognition. Meanwhile, Claire stepped out of another meeting into the cool air of early evening, the city glowing with soft light, the rhythm of traffic steady, familiar, and she walked without urgency, her mind clear, not because there was nothing left to do, but because what mattered most had already been set in motion. Her phone buzzed once, a brief update confirming another alignment, another piece falling exactly where it needed to, and she allowed herself a small pause at the edge of the sidewalk, watching as people moved past her, unaware of the quiet shifts shaping the world around them. She remembered, distantly, what it felt like to stand in a room and wonder if she belonged there, to measure herself against expectations she did not create. And now that memory felt like something borrowed, something that no longer fit. She crossed the street as the signal changed, her steps steady, her presence unforced. And somewhere behind her, in offices and boardrooms she no longer needed to enter, decisions continued to adjust around her influence, not because she demanded it, but because it was already understood. And as the city lights flickered on one by one, reflecting in windows that stretched endlessly upward, the only thing that remained certain, quiet, and absolute was that control had never been about who stood in the spotlight. It had always belonged to the one who understood the structure behind it. And Claire had learned that long before anyone realized she was already in position. The shift became visible not in announcements, but in absence. The absence of certainty in rooms that once revolved effortlessly around Ethan, the absence of immediate agreement. When he spoke, the absence of that quiet, unspoken alignment that used to follow him without question, and now every meeting carried a different weight, a hesitation that lingered just beneath the surface, subtle enough to deny, but impossible to ignore. He stood at the head of the table once again, delivering projections with the same measured tone, the same polished confidence. But something in the room resisted him, not openly, not disrespectfully, just enough to remind him that authority, once fractured, did not return the same way. Across from him, board members exchanged glances that lasted half a second too long, their attention shifting not to him, but to documents, to figures, to structures that now extended beyond his reach. And for the first time, Ethan understood that control was no longer something he could assert. It was something he would have to request, and even that was no longer guaranteed. Vanessa noticed it before he said anything, the way his voice tightened, slightly at the end of a sentence, the way his gaze lingered on the screen instead of the people around him. And though she maintained her composure, her reflection in the glass revealed something else, something sharper, a quiet calculation beginning to replace the effortless confidence she once carried. Later that evening, the same kind of ballroom that once celebrated them now felt different, the lighting still golden, the music still soft, but the energy shifted, conversations drifting just far enough to exclude, attention redirecting in ways too subtle to confront. And Vanessa stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a gesture that once signaled status, now feeling almost like reassurance. "They are watching," she murmured under her breath, her voice smooth but edged with awareness. And Ethan followed her gaze, noticing the way people looked, not directly, but carefully, measuring, reassessing. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be the subject of quiet evaluation instead of admiration. Across the room, a group of investors spoke in low tones, one of them glancing briefly toward him before shifting focus again, and the absence of acknowledgement landed heavier than any direct confrontation could have. Meanwhile, Claire stood in a different room entirely, smaller, quieter, the kind of space that did not rely on spectacle to hold significance. And yet the conversation unfolding there carried more weight than any gala or public display, because this was where decisions were shaped without the need for performance. She listened as strategies were outlined, her presence calm, her responses precise, and when she spoke, the room adjusted, not dramatically, but naturally, as if it had always been designed to follow her lead. There was no need for emphasis, no need for reinforcement, because her position was already understood, already accepted. As the meeting concluded, one of the executives paused slightly, offering a nod that held more respect than words could express. and Claire acknowledged it with the same quiet composure she carried into every space now. Because recognition, she had learned, did not need to be requested when it was already earned. Later, as she stepped outside into the cool night air, the city alive with distant lights and steady motion, she paused for just a moment, not to reflect, not to celebrate, but simply to exist within the space she had created for herself. And somewhere across the city, in rooms filled with glass and gold, the realization continued to settle, slow and undeniable, that power had not disappeared. It had simply changed hands, and not everyone had noticed when it happened. By the end of the month, the shift no longer needed to hide behind subtlety. It had settled into something visible, something people could feel without needing it explained, and Ethan stood at the edge of that realization, watching as decisions that once passed through him now moved around him, not abruptly, not disrespectfully, but with a quiet efficiency that left no space for interruption. He adjusted his tie in the reflection of his office window, the skyline stretching behind him, still the same, still vast, but no longer echoing the certainty he used to carry so easily. And as he turned back toward his desk, the silence in the room felt heavier, not empty, but filled with something he could not control. Vanessa sat nearby, flipping through a tablet, her posture still composed, but the rhythm of her movements slightly sharper, more deliberate, as if she were recalibrating her place in a narrative that was no longer as predictable as it once seemed. And when she looked up at him, there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, before she spoke. "People are talking," she said, her tone measured, and Ethan nodded once. Already aware, already feeling it in every delayed response, every careful conversation, every glance that lingered just long enough to suggest something unspoken. Across the city, Claire moved through her own day with the same steady pace, the same quiet authority, but now the difference was not in what she did, it was in how the world responded to her, because recognition had shifted from subtle to certain, and when she entered a room, conversations adjusted without hesitation, attention aligning naturally, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. She sat at the head of another meeting, sunlight cutting across the table in clean lines, and as reports were presented, she listened with the same calm focus, her questions precise, her decisions measured, each one reinforcing a structure that no longer needed to prove itself. An executive hesitated for a moment before asking, "Should we proceed with the acquisition under your directive?" And Claire met his gaze, offering a small nod that carried more weight than any extended explanation. Because authority, once established, did not require repetition. Later that evening, as she walked through the city, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet energy of a place that never truly stopped, she passed by a familiar building, its glass facade reflecting the movement of traffic and light. And for a moment, she recognized it, not as something she had lost, but as something she had moved beyond. Inside, Ethan stood in a room that still carried his name on the door, but no longer held the same meaning. And as he looked out at the city, the realization settled fully, not sudden, not dramatic, but complete. That control was not something you could reclaim once it had shifted in a way you did not see coming. His phone buzzed with another update, another confirmation of a decision made without him. And this time, he did not reach for it immediately, because he already understood what it would say. Somewhere in that same city, Claire paused at a crosswalk, the signal blinking softly as cars passed, and as she stepped forward, her reflection briefly visible in the glass of a passing vehicle. She did not see the woman who had been dismissed, or the one who had returned. She saw someone entirely separate from both, someone who no longer needed to be part of that story at all. And as the light changed behind her, and the city continued its endless motion, the truth remained quiet but undeniable. That power had not been taken in a moment of confrontation. It had been built in silence, secured in patience, and revealed only when it could no longer be undone. The announcement did not come with fanfare. It appeared in a quiet internal memo first, then in carefully worded press releases, the kind that masked significance behind neutral language. But anyone who understood the structure could read between the lines, and Claire did not need to read it twice to know exactly what had just been finalized. She stood by the window of her office, the city stretching endlessly below, morning light catching on steel and glass, and as she held the document in her hand. Her fingers remained steady, her breath even, because this was never about surprise, it was about timing. Across town, Ethan read the same release on his screen, the words sharp in their simplicity, leadership restructuring effective immediately. And for a moment, the room around him felt smaller, not physically, but in the way certainty contracts when it no longer holds. And as he scrolled, each line confirmed what he had already begun to understand, that the company he built was no longer shaped by his decisions alone. Vanessa stood behind him, her reflection faint in the glass, her silence louder than any reaction she could have given, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, stripped of the effortless confidence she once carried. "What does this mean for you?" she asked, and Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he could not yet accept. Meanwhile, in a conference room lined with understated elegance, Claire sat at the head of the table as the board finalized their positions, the atmosphere calm, deliberate, the kind of environment where decisions did not need to be defended because they were already understood. One of the senior members leaned forward slightly, his tone respectful. "Your directive moving forward," he began, and Claire met his gaze without hesitation. "We proceed with stability," she replied, her voice even, measured, not driven by urgency, but by control, and the room aligned instantly, not out of obligation, but because her presence had already defined the direction. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening within its tallest buildings. And as Claire stepped out later that afternoon, the air carried a light chill, the kind that sharpened awareness without discomfort, and she walked without distraction, her pace steady, her thoughts clear, not focused on what had been taken, but on what had been secured. She passed a reflection of herself in a storefront window, pausing for just a fraction of a second, not to admire, not to question, but to recognize, because the woman staring back was no longer defined by the room she once stood in, or the people who once overlooked her. She was defined by the space she now occupied. Without permission, back in his office, Ethan stood alone, the skyline unchanged, but everything else subtly altered, and as he set his phone down, the silence around him no longer felt like a pause. It felt like a conclusion, one that had been written long before he realized he was part of it. And somewhere between those two spaces, between what had been and what now existed, the truth settled with quiet certainty. That power had never belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It had always belonged to the one who understood when to speak, and more importantly, when to act. And Claire had already done both long before anyone thought to notice. The room was quieter this time, not because there were fewer people, but because there was nothing left to question, and Claire sat at the head of the long table as the final documents were reviewed, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, as if she had always belonged there, as if the path that led to this moment had never been uncertain. The board members spoke with clarity now, their tone aligned, their decisions flowing without resistance, and when they looked at her, it was no longer with curiosity or caution, but with recognition, the kind that does not need to be earned twice. Across the city, Ethan stood in a space that still carried his name, but no longer carried his authority, the walls the same, the skyline unchanged, yet everything within it felt distant, as if he were observing a version of his life that no longer responded to him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to sit with that realization without trying to reshape it, without searching for a way to reclaim what had already shifted beyond his reach. Vanessa lingered near the window, her reflection no longer blending seamlessly with his, her presence quieter now, more contained, and when she spoke, her voice held a different kind of clarity. "You did not see it coming," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that truth settling fully for the first time. "No," he replied, his voice lower, steadier. "I did not." Meanwhile, Claire signed the final page placed before her, the pen moving with the same calm precision it always had, and as she set it down, there was no sense of climax, no dramatic shift, only completion, the kind that comes when something has been built exactly as intended. One of the senior board members leaned forward slightly, offering a nod that carried both respect and acknowledgement. "It is official," he said, and Claire met his gaze with a quiet understanding. Because she had known long before the words were spoken that this moment would arrive. Later, as she stepped out into the late afternoon light, the city stretched wide beneath a sky turning soft with the approach of evening, and she paused for just a second, not to reflect on what had been taken or what had been lost, but to recognize the stillness within herself, the absence of doubt, the absence of anything unresolved. She walked forward, her steps steady, her presence unforced, blending into the rhythm of the city that no longer felt distant or separate from her. And as she moved through it, the past no longer followed, not because it had been erased, but because it no longer held any weight in the direction she was going. Behind her, in offices and rooms that once defined her place in the world, conversations would continue, adjustments would be made, and Ethan would remain within that structure, no longer at its center, but still part of its outcome. And for him, the understanding would settle slowly, not in a single moment, but in a series of quiet realizations that could not be undone. And as the evening light faded into the glow of the city's endless movement, the only truth that remained, steady and undeniable, was that she had never needed to fight for her place. She had simply built one that no one could take from her, and by the time anyone realized it, it was already too late to change it. Something more reflective, as if he were finally seeing the full shape of what had happened rather than the version he had believed. Vanessa stood beside him less often now, her presence still polished, still composed, but no longer anchored to his in the same effortless way. And when she spoke, her tone carried a distance that had not been there before. "Things change," she said one evening, her voice calm, almost observational. And Ethan nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because he understood now that change was not something that arrived all at once. It was something that had been building long before he ever noticed it. Meanwhile, Claire found herself undeniable, not in what they had, but in what they no longer needed, because where one had lost control, the other had found something far more enduring, a sense of place that did not depend on anyone else to define it. And in that quiet contrast, the story that once connected them finally reached its natural end, not with confrontation, not with words, but with the simple, undeniable truth that she had moved forward, completely, and left nothing behind that could hold her back. Once stood in rooms waiting to be acknowledged, no shadow of the version of herself shaped by someone else's expectations, only clarity, steady and complete, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. She picked up her coat, the fabric smooth beneath her fingers, and moved toward the door, her steps unhurried, her presence light, not because the weight of the past had been lifted, but because it had been set down long before this moment arrived. Outside, the air carried the crisp edge of a new day, the city alive with quiet momentum. And as she stepped into it, she did not look back, not out of resolve, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing behind her that held any relevance to where she was going. And somewhere, in the spaces that once defined both of them, the story that had tied their lives together faded into something distant, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer active, no longer shaping anything that mattered. And as Claire moved forward, blending seamlessly into the flow of a world that no longer needed to recognize her to confirm her place within it, the only truth